Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Whispers. Tonight, we leave behind the safety of city streets and venture onto one of the most mysterious and feared roads in America. Highway 375, better known as the UFO Highway. Out here in the Nevada desert, the night presses close, the silence is thick, and the air seems to carry secrets that defy explanation. For truckers, Highway 375, the UFO Highway, is more than just a route. It's a stretch of road where headlights sometimes reveal shapes that shouldn't exist, where phantom figures appear and vanish without a trace, and where CB radios crackle with voices from who knows where. Many who have driven these lonely miles swear something watches them from the darkness just beyond the reach of their lights. The 10 stories you're about to hear are collected from truckers who have braved Highway 375, the UFO Highway, and lived to tell the tales. These are real encounters where the line between reality and nightmare fades, and a reminder that sometimes the real danger isn't the road itself, but the things waiting in the dark. If you're new to Horror Whispers, subscribe for nightly stories that explore the haunted, the strange, and the unexplained. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the chilling stories most people are too afraid to share. So, dim the lights, buckle up, and keep your eyes on the road ahead. Tonight we're diving into 10 true horror stories from truckers on Highway 375, the UFO Highway. My name is Jack Thompson, and I've been hauling freight across this great nation for 23 years. I've seen everything you could imagine on these highways. Accidents that would make your stomach turn. Weather that could kill a man, and more close calls than I care to count. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Highway 375 that October night in 2022. I was running a load from Reno to Las Vegas, nothing special. Just electronics equipment for a big box store. The load was sealed tight, worth about $40,000, and I had the paperwork to prove every piece was accounted for. My dispatcher had routed me through Highway 375 to save time. They call it the Extraterrestrial Highway, but us truckers just call it the loneliest stretch of asphalt in America. It's 98 miles of nothing but desert, sagebrush, and the occasional jackrabbit stupid enough to play chicken with an 18-wheeler. I'd driven this route maybe 50 times in my career, always during the day. This was my first night run on 375, and I'll tell you, the desert takes on a whole different personality after the sun goes down. The silence out there is so complete it makes your ears ring. No radio stations come through clear, no cell towers for miles. Just you and the endless black ribbon of road stretching toward Vegas. I remember checking my watch when I passed the Extraterrestrial Highway sign. It was 11:47 p.m. The trailer was pulling smooth, engine purring like a kitten, and I was making good time. I figured I'd be in Vegas by 3 a.m., maybe grab some breakfast and catch a few hours of sleep before my next pickup. That was the plan anyway. About 40 miles into the desert stretch, I started hearing this sound. At first, I thought it was just wind, but it wasn't like any wind I'd ever heard. It was more like humming, like when you run your finger around the rim of a wine glass, but deeper, more resonant. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I checked my mirrors, thinking maybe I had a tire going flat or something in the trailer had come loose, but everything looked normal. The humming got louder as I drove, and that's when I started feeling something strange. The trailer felt different, lighter somehow. Now I've been pulling trailers for over 2 decades, and you develop a sixth sense about your load. You feel every bump, every shift, every change in the weight distribution through the steering wheel and the way the truck handles. Something was off. I thought maybe I'd blown a tire on the trailer, so I pulled over at the next wide spot in the road, just a patch of gravel off to the side with one of those emergency call boxes that probably hasn't worked since the Clinton administration. I grabbed my flashlight and walked back to do a visual inspection of the trailer. That's when my blood turned to ice water. The trailer doors were still locked, sealed tight with the same security seal I'd inspected in Reno. The tires were fine, no damage, proper inflation. But when I knocked on the side of the trailer, it sounded hollow. Not partially empty hollow, completely empty hollow. Like knocking on an empty metal box. I went around to the front of the trailer and tried to lift it manually, something you can't do with a loaded trailer. It lifted like it was empty. $40,000 worth of electronics equipment gone. Just gone. I'm standing there in the middle of the Nevada desert at 1 in the morning staring at my trailer, and I'm starting to feel like I'm losing my mind. I called my dispatcher on the satellite phone and Jerry picks up on the second ring. Jack? What's wrong? You're not supposed to be delivering until 6 a.m. Jerry, I said, and my voice was shaking, I need you to call the shipper. Check on my load. Something's not right. What do you mean something's not right? Are you broken down? I explained the situation as best I could about the humming sound and the trailer feeling light and the hollow sound when I knocked on it. Jerry went quiet for a long time, then he came back on the line. Jack, I just called the shipper. They confirmed your load was sealed and secured before you left. 47 pallets of electronics, total weight 34,000 pounds. Are you sure you're feeling all right? I walked back to the trailer and grabbed the security seal, reading him the numbers. They matched his paperwork exactly, but I knew what I was feeling, what I was hearing when I knocked on that trailer. It was empty. Jerry, I'm telling you, this trailer is empty. I don't know how, I don't know when, but whatever was in here is gone. The next 3 hours were a nightmare of phone calls. Jerry contacted the shipping company, who contacted their security people, who contacted the police. A Nevada state trooper showed up around 4 a.m., followed by a detective and someone from the insurance company. They cut the seal and opened the trailer doors. Empty. Completely, utterly empty. Not a single pallet, not a scrap of packaging material, nothing. The trailer was as clean as the day it rolled off the assembly line. The strange thing was there was no evidence of a break-in. The locks were intact, the seal unbroken, no damage to the trailer walls or floor. The security cameras at the truck stop where I'd taken my last break showed me pulling out with a fully loaded trailer, but somehow, somewhere in that stretch of desert highway, $40,000 worth of merchandise had vanished into thin air. The insurance investigation took months. They interviewed me probably a dozen times, put me through polygraph tests, hired private investigators to follow me around. They thought I was running some kind of inside job, that I had accomplices who somehow unloaded the trailer while I wasn't looking. But the security footage from my truck's dash cam showed continuous driving. No stops except for the one where I discovered the trailer was empty. The case was eventually closed as an unexplained loss. The insurance company paid out, but they dropped me as a driver. Word got around the trucking community. Not that I was crooked, but that something weird had happened on my run, and some companies don't want that kind of publicity. It took me 6 months to find steady work again. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what happened to me after that night. I started having dreams, vivid dreams about being lifted out of my truck cab while I was driving. In the dreams, I'm floating above my truck, watching it drive itself down Highway 375 while these bright lights surround my trailer. I can see figures moving around the trailer, but I can never make out what they look like. They're unloading something, but it's not cargo. It's like they're taking samples, specimens, pieces of our technology to study. I wake up from these dreams in a cold sweat, and sometimes I find marks on my arms, little puncture wounds that weren't there when I went to sleep. My doctor says they're probably from bug bites or minor scratches, but I know they're not. They're too precise, too clean, like someone took samples. The dreams got so bad that I started seeing a therapist. Dr. Martinez was a nice lady who specialized in trauma counseling for truck drivers. Apparently, we have higher rates of PTSD than people realize. She helped me work through some of the stress and paranoia, but she could never explain what happened to my cargo that night. I still drive Highway 375 sometimes during the day now, never at night. I've talked to other truckers who've had strange experiences on that stretch of road. Electronics failing, time seeming to skip, cargo mysteriously shifting or going missing. There's something about that highway, something about the desert around Area 51 that defies explanation. Last month I was talking to a driver named Maria at a truck stop in Barstow, and she told me she'd had her own experience on 375. Strange lights following her trailer, radio interference, missing time. We compared notes and the similarities were unsettling. Too many coincidences, too many unexplained incidents for it all to be just imagination or equipment failure. I've thought about changing careers, maybe becoming a local driver, staying close to home. But trucking is in my blood, and despite everything that happened, I can't give up the open road. I just make sure to avoid night runs on Highway 375. Whatever took my cargo that night is still out there, still watching, still waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to come along. Sometimes, when I'm driving through the Nevada desert during the day, I'll see other truckers pulled over on the side of the road, checking their trailers, looking confused and scared. I always stop to help if I can, but there's not much you can say to a man who's just discovered that the laws of physics don't apply to Highway 375 after dark. The humming sound still haunts me. Sometimes late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I hear it again. That low resonant hum that seems to come from somewhere beyond our world. And when I hear it, I know they're still out there, still taking what they need from our world, one truck at a time. My name is Maria Lopez, and I've been driving truck for 15 years. I'm a single mother with 2 kids back home in Phoenix, and this job has given us a good life. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghost stories or alien abductions or any of that nonsense you see on TV. I'm practical, down to earth, and I deal in facts. But what happened to me on Highway 375 last spring has shaken everything I thought I knew about the world. I was hauling produce from California to Denver, a load of lettuce and tomatoes that had to get there fresh. The route my dispatcher gave me took me through Vegas and then up through Utah, but there was construction on I-15 that would have delayed me by hours. My load was already cutting it close on time, and spoiled produce means no payment and possibly losing my contract. So I decided to take Highway 375 across Nevada to connect with US 6, a route I'd only driven once before during the day. It was about 10 p.m. when I entered Highway 375, and the first thing that struck me was how absolutely dark it was. I mean, I've driven through rural areas before, but this was different. No farmhouse lights, no gas stations, no other traffic. Just my headlights cutting through the blackness and the pale stripe of the center line guiding me forward. I had been driving for maybe 20 minutes when I first noticed the lights in my mirrors. At first, I assumed it was another truck running behind me, maybe a quarter-mile back. The lights were red, probably taillights from someone running without their headlights on, which is dangerous but not unheard of in areas where truckers are trying to avoid attracting attention from DOT inspectors. But as I watched the lights in my mirror, I started to notice something odd. They weren't getting closer or falling further behind. They were maintaining an exact distance, matching my speed perfectly. When I sped up to 65, they sped up. When I slowed down for a curve, they slowed down. It was like they were connected to my truck by an invisible string. I tried flashing my brake lights, thinking maybe it was another trucker who wanted to pass but was being cautious about the narrow road. No response. I tried my CB radio, calling out on channel 19 to see if anyone was back there. Static. Not even the usual chatter you get from truckers running the interstates. The lights stayed with me for another hour, and I was starting to get nervous. I'm a woman driving alone through the desert at night, and while I carry protection and know how to use it, something about this situation felt wrong. The lights weren't acting like any vehicle I'd ever encountered. That's when I noticed they weren't touching the ground. I kept looking in my mirrors, trying to figure out what I was seeing. The lights were red, bright red, but they were floating about 10 feet off the road surface. No headlights, no running lights, no shape of a vehicle underneath them. Just two red orbs hanging in the air behind me. My heart started pounding, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was some kind of experimental military aircraft. We were near Area 51 after all. Maybe it was a helicopter with some kind of special lighting. I'd heard stories about the military testing weird stuff in this part of Nevada, but helicopters make noise, and I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my diesel engine and road noise, and helicopters don't fly in perfect formation 20 feet behind a truck for over an hour. I decided to test whatever was following me. I pulled over at a wide spot on the shoulder and shut off my engine. If it was military, they'd probably radio me or fly over and continue on their way. If it was some kind of natural phenomenon, it would probably dissipate or move on. The lights stopped when I stopped, hovering motionless about 100 feet behind my truck. I sat there in the cab, engine off, listening to the absolute silence of the Nevada desert. No wind, no insects, no sound at all except my own breathing and heartbeat. After about 5 minutes, the lights started moving. Not forward or backward, but side to side, like they were scanning or searching for something. Then they started to separate, one moving to the left side of the road, the other to the right. They were spreading out, flanking my truck. That's when fear really set in. This wasn't military, and it wasn't natural. This was something else entirely, something that showed intelligence and purpose. I started my engine and pulled back onto the highway, but instead of staying behind me, the lights now took positions on either side of my truck. I could see them clearly now, one in my left mirror and one through the passenger window. They were perfect spheres of red light, about the size of a basketball with no visible source of illumination. They weren't hot like flares or searchlights. There was no heat distortion in the air around them. They just glowed with this steady, pulsing red light that seemed almost alive. As I drove, the lights started moving closer to my truck. The one on the passenger side dropped down until it was level with my cab, maybe 20 feet away. I could see my truck reflected in its surface like it was made of polished metal, but glowing from within. That's when my truck started having problems. The radio began cycling through stations on its own, picking up fragments of conversations in languages I didn't recognize. The GPS display started flickering between normal road maps and star charts. My engine temperature gauge jumped to the red zone, then back to normal, then to red again. I was doing about 60 miles per hour when the lights suddenly accelerated past me, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. They shot ahead of my truck and then stopped, hovering directly over the roadway about a quarter mile in front of me. I had no choice but to drive toward them. As I got closer, the lights descended until they were maybe 50 feet above the road. I could feel something in the air, like the static electricity you get before a thunderstorm, but stronger. The hair on my arms was standing up, and there was a metallic taste in my mouth. Then my truck started pulling to the left, toward the shoulder. I was fighting the steering wheel, but it was like the truck had a mind of its own. The lights were definitely controlling it somehow, drawing me off the road toward a flat area of desert where they wanted me to stop. I've always been stubborn, and 15 years of trucking had taught me not to back down from a fight. I downshifted and floored the accelerator, gunning straight for the lights ahead of me. If whatever was controlling them wanted my truck, they were going to have to work for it. The lights separated as I approached, moving up and to the sides, but my truck was still pulling toward the shoulder. I could feel the steering wheel vibrating in my hands, and the cab was starting to fill with that red glow. Every metal surface in the truck was becoming warm to the touch. Just when I thought I was going to lose control completely, I saw something ahead that gave me hope. The headlights of another vehicle coming from the opposite direction. It was the first traffic I'd seen in hours, and as soon as those headlights appeared, the red lights shot straight up into the sky and disappeared. The effect on my truck was immediate. The steering returned to normal. The radio stopped cycling and the GPS went back to showing Highway 375. The other vehicle turned out to be a Nevada state trooper, probably doing routine patrol on the highway. He passed me with a friendly wave, having no idea that he'd just saved me from God knows what. I drove the rest of Highway 375 without incident, but I couldn't stop shaking. When I got to the truck stop in Tonopah, I pulled over and did a complete inspection of my rig. What I found made my blood run cold. There were scorch marks on the metal surfaces of my truck, not burn marks from heat, but patterns that looked almost like circuit boards etched into the aluminum. The marks were concentrated around the cab and the front of the trailer, like something had been scanning or mapping my truck's systems. My engine oil, which I'd changed just 500 miles earlier, was black as tar and had metal shavings in it that my mechanic said looked like they'd been atomically sheared. My battery, which was brand new, was completely dead and had to be replaced. The truck's computer system had to be reset because it was throwing error codes that the manufacturer said were impossible. But the strangest thing was my logbook. I'm meticulous about keeping accurate records. DOT violations can cost you your license. But according to my logbook, I'd lost 3 hours somewhere on Highway 375. I remembered the encounter with the lights lasting maybe 45 minutes, but my arrival time at the truck stop suggested I'd been on that stretch of highway for nearly 4 hours. I filed a report with the state police, but they classified it as equipment malfunction and suggested I have my truck serviced. The insurance company covered the repairs, but they made it clear that they thought I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. The produce load made it to Denver on time, but something had happened to it during transport. About half the lettuce had developed these strange brown patterns that looked almost like the scorch marks on my truck. The tomatoes had fermented in a way that my buyer said he'd never seen before, like they'd been exposed to some kind of radiation. I've driven Highway 375 3 more times since then, always during the day, and I've never seen the red lights again. But I've talked to other truckers who have had similar experiences on that route. There's a whole network of drivers who share stories about strange encounters in the Nevada desert, and most of us have learned to avoid that highway after dark. My kids ask me sometimes why I won't take the night runs anymore, why I'm so careful about my routes through certain parts of the Southwest. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that their mother was chased across the desert by something that defies everything we know about physics and reality? I still drive truck, and I still love the freedom of the open road. But I've learned that there are some roads that are better traveled in daylight, with other people around. Highway 375 has earned its nickname as the Extraterrestrial Highway, and after what happened to me that night, I understand why the locals avoid it after sunset. Sometimes when I'm driving through the desert on other routes, I'll catch a glimpse of red light in my peripheral vision, and my heart will start racing. But when I look directly at it, it's always just a radio tower or cell phone antenna. At least that's what I tell myself. The truth is, I know they're still out there, those red lights in the desert. And I have a feeling that my encounter with them wasn't the end of something, but the beginning. They let me go that night, but I don't think they're done with me yet. I'm Tom Richards, been driving long haul for 12 years now. I've got a wife and 3 kids back in Bakersfield, and I try to get home every weekend if I can manage it. I'm not the kind of guy who usually tells stories like this one, but what happened to me on Highway 375 last winter has been eating at me for months. My wife says I should talk to someone about it, so here goes. It was February, bitter cold even for the desert, and I was running a load of auto parts from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City. The weather was nasty. Not snow, but that cold rain that cuts right through you and makes the roads slick as glass. I'd been driving for about 10 hours and was looking forward to getting some rest, but my dispatcher called and said there was a bonus if I could get the load there by morning. Money's tight with 3 kids and a mortgage, so I said yes. The original route had me going up through Vegas and then I-15, but there was a massive pileup north of Vegas that had the interstate shut down. Traffic was backed up for miles, and sitting in traffic burns fuel without making miles. My GPS suggested Highway 375 as an alternate route, and even though I'd heard other drivers call it spooky, it looked like it would save me time. I'd never driven Highway 375 before, and the first thing that struck me was how empty it was. This was about 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and I didn't see another vehicle for the first hour. Just endless black desert on both sides, with my headlights carving out a little bubble of visibility in the darkness. The rain was coming down harder now, and my wipers were having trouble keeping up. Visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. And I was having to really concentrate to keep the truck on the road. That's probably why I almost missed him. He was standing on the right shoulder, maybe 100 yards ahead, just at the edge of my headlight reach. At first I thought it might be another trucker with a breakdown, but as I got closer I could see it was just a man in dark clothes, soaking wet with his thumb out. Now every trucking company has a policy against picking up hitchhikers. Too much liability, too many bad stories about drivers getting robbed or worse. But this guy looked desperate, standing out there in the freezing rain in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was probably 50 miles away, and nobody else was on this road. If I left him there, he'd probably die of exposure before dawn. I pulled over about 20 feet past him and watched in my mirror as he jogged up to the passenger door. When he climbed up into the cab, that's when I got my first good look at him. He was maybe 40 years old, average height and build, with dark hair plastered to his head from the rain. His clothes were soaked through, jeans, a dark jacket, work boots that had seen better days. But here's the thing that struck me as odd. He wasn't shivering. It was maybe 30 degrees outside with a cold rain, and this guy had been standing out there God knows how long, but he wasn't shaking or showing any signs of being cold. "Thank you," he said, settling into the passenger seat. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and he didn't make eye contact. "I appreciate the ride." "No problem," I said, putting the truck back in gear. "Where are you heading?" He was quiet for a long time, staring out the windshield at the rain. Finally, he said, "North. Just keep driving north." I tried to make conversation as we drove, asked him what he was doing out there, if he had car trouble, if there was someone I could call for him. He gave short, vague answers that didn't really tell me anything. After about 20 minutes, I gave up trying to talk to him and focused on driving. That's when I started noticing strange things about my passenger. For one thing, the cab wasn't warming up. I had the heater running full blast, but the temperature inside felt like it was dropping instead of rising. I could see my breath when I exhaled, which should have been impossible with the heater running. And the smell, or rather the lack of smell. The guy had been standing in the rain for who knows how long, but he didn't smell like wet clothes or road grime or body odor. He didn't smell like anything at all. It was like he was absorbing all the scent from the air around him. The radio started acting up too. I'd been listening to a talk show out of Las Vegas, but it faded to static and then started picking up fragments of other stations. Classical music, Spanish talk radio, what sounded like old radio dramas from the 1940s. The signal would fade in and out. Randomly and occasionally I'd hear what sounded like numbers being read in monotone voices. I glanced at my passenger to see if the radio was bothering him, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. I couldn't see his reflection in the passenger window. The window was fogged up from the temperature difference, but I could see my own reflection clearly. His seat looked empty in the reflection, even though I could see him sitting right there. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just the angle of the light, or condensation on the window was distorting things. I reached over to adjust the passenger mirror, trying to get a better look at him, but when I looked in the mirror, the passenger seat appeared empty. "Something wrong?" he asked, and his voice seemed to come from somewhere behind me, even though he was sitting right there in the passenger seat. "No," I managed to say, "just checking the mirrors." We drove in silence for another hour, and the strangeness kept building. The temperature in the cab continued to drop, and I started seeing my breath even more clearly. Ice was forming on the inside of the windshield, which should have been impossible with the defroster running. I had to keep scraping it off with my credit card to maintain visibility. The rain outside was getting worse, and I was starting to have trouble keeping the truck on the road. The highway was winding through some hills now, with steep drop-offs on both sides. In weather like this, one wrong move could send us rolling down a cliff face. That's when my passenger spoke again. "Slow down," he said. "There's something ahead." I couldn't see anything through the rain and darkness, but something in his voice made me hit the brakes. Good thing I did, because about 50 feet ahead, a massive tree had fallen across the highway. In the desert, trees are rare, and a tree big enough to block the road completely was unheard of. But there it was, a huge pine tree lying across both lanes. "How did you see that?" I asked him. "I couldn't see anything." He didn't answer. I put the truck in park and grabbed my flashlight to get out and assess the situation. The tree was enormous, maybe 4 feet in diameter, and it would take heavy equipment to move it. There was no way around it. The shoulders were too soft and the drop-offs were too steep. I got back in the cab, soaking wet and frustrated. "We're stuck," I said. "I'll have to call for help and wait for a road crew." "Keep driving," my passenger said. "What? Did you not see that tree? It's blocking the entire road." "Trust me," he said. "Just drive forward slowly." I thought he was crazy, but something in his voice compelled me to do what he said. I put the truck in gear and crept forward toward the tree. As we got closer, I could see it clearly in my headlights. Definitely real. Definitely blocking the road completely. But when we reached it, the truck passed right through it like it wasn't there. I slammed on the brakes and looked back in my mirrors. The tree was gone. The road behind us was clear, wet asphalt reflecting my taillights. I sat there for a full minute, trying to process what had just happened. "Keep driving," my passenger said again. "We need to reach the junction before dawn." I was too shaken to argue. I drove for another hour, the cab getting colder and colder, my passenger sitting silently beside me. The radio continued to malfunction, cycling through stations that didn't seem to exist, playing music and programs that sounded like they were from decades past. Around 4 a.m., we reached the junction with US 6. "This is where I get out," my passenger said. I pulled over at the intersection, and he opened the door and stepped down from the cab. I watched him walk around to the front of the truck, and for just a moment he was illuminated by my headlights. That's when I saw his face clearly for the first time. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like they were made of polished obsidian. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was something wrong with the way he moved, like he wasn't quite solid. "Thank you for the ride," he said, his voice now coming from outside the truck, even though his mouth wasn't moving. "You'll be safe now." He walked away from the truck toward the desert, and I watched him in my headlights until he disappeared into the darkness. As soon as he was gone, the temperature in the cab started returning to normal, and the radio picked up a clear signal from a country station out of Utah. I drove the rest of the way to Salt Lake City in a daze. When I arrived at the delivery point, I realized that according to my logbook and the truck's computer, I'd made the trip in record time. Somehow, that 8-hour drive had only taken me 6 hours, despite the weather and the detour. I delivered the load and found a truck stop to get some sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking about my passenger. Who was he? Where had he come from? And how had he known about that tree blocking the road? Over the next few days, I did some research on Highway 375. Turns out there have been dozens of reports over the years of strange passengers and mysterious hitchhikers on that stretch of road. Most drivers who pick them up report similar experiences. The cold temperature, the radio interference, the lack of reflection. Some drivers have reported that their mysterious passengers warned them about hazards or accidents ahead, saving their lives. I talked to another trucker named Bill Henderson who had a similar experience a few years earlier. He picked up a woman in a white dress who guided him around a massive accident that happened an hour before emergency crews even knew about it. Like me, he said the woman had no reflection and made the cab unnaturally cold. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that my passenger wasn't human. Maybe he was the spirit of someone who died on that highway. Maybe he was something else entirely. But whatever he was, I think he saved my life that night. Without his warning about the tree, I would have plowed into it at highway speed and probably gone over the side of the mountain. I've driven Highway 375 a few more times since then, always hoping to see him again. But it's never happened. The highway seems normal now during the day, just another stretch of desert road through Nevada. But I won't drive it at night anymore. There's something about that road after dark that belongs to the hitchhikers and the spirits and the things that exist in the spaces between our world and whatever lies beyond. My wife thinks I imagined the whole thing, that I was tired and the weather was playing tricks on my mind. My kids think it's a cool ghost story, but I know what I experienced that night, and I know my passenger was real, even if he wasn't alive. Sometimes when I'm driving other routes late at night, I'll see someone standing on the shoulder with their thumb out, and I'll slow down to help. But then I'll remember that cold cab and those black eyes, and I'll keep driving. Some rides are worth the risk, but some passengers are carrying more baggage than any truck can handle. I still wonder about him sometimes, about where he came from and where he went after I dropped him off. But mostly I'm just grateful that he was there that night, watching over Highway 375 and the drivers foolish enough to brave it in the dark. The name's Kevin Brooks, and I've been running freight through the Southwest for 8 years now. I drive for a small outfit out of Phoenix, mostly hauling construction materials and equipment to job sites throughout Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and keeps me on the road, which is where I'm happiest. In September of last year, I got a rush delivery. A load of specialized concrete forms that had to get from Phoenix to a construction site outside of Ely, Nevada by morning. The regular route through Vegas would have put me there too late, so my dispatcher suggested Highway 375 as a shortcut. I'd heard stories about that road, but I'd never driven it myself, and I figured most of the tales were just trucker folklore designed to spook the rookies. I left Phoenix around 9 p.m., and the first part of the run was routine. Clear skies, good visibility, light traffic. I made good time getting to the Highway 375 junction, and I was feeling confident about making my delivery window. The weather report had called for clear skies all night, so I wasn't expecting any problems. Highway 375 starts off normal enough. Just another desert highway cutting through the middle of nowhere. But about 30 miles in, I started to notice something strange. The stars, which had been brilliant and clear when I started, were beginning to fade. Not like clouds were rolling in, but like something was absorbing the light from above. At first, I thought maybe it was just my eyes adjusting after hours of staring at the road, but when I looked in my mirrors, I could see stars clearly behind me. It was only ahead that the sky was going dark. Within about 10 minutes, I couldn't see any stars at all in front of the truck. That's when the fog started. It began as just wisps of mist crossing the highway, nothing unusual for a desert night. But the fog kept getting thicker, and it wasn't behaving like any fog I'd ever seen before. Normal fog drifts with the wind, but this stuff was moving against the breeze, forming patterns and shapes that almost looked deliberate. Within 15 minutes, the fog was so thick I could barely see the road markings. I had to slow down to about 30 miles per hour and turn on all my lights, including the flashers. The fog seemed to glow with its own pale light, like it was illuminated from within. It was beautiful in a way, but also deeply unsettling. I tried the CB radio to see if any other drivers were dealing with the same conditions, but all I got was static. Not the normal kind of static you get when you're out of range, but a rhythmic pulsing that almost sounded like Morse code. I'm not trained in Morse, but the patterns seemed too regular to be random interference. The fog continued to thicken until I could barely see 10 feet ahead of the truck. I was essentially driving blind, following the center line and hoping nothing was in the road ahead of me. That's when I started seeing the shapes. At first, I thought they were just tricks of the light, shadows cast by my headlights through the swirling fog. But as I watched, the shapes became more defined, more purposeful. They were tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and impossibly thin. They moved alongside the highway, keeping pace with my truck, but they didn't walk like people. Their movement was too fluid, too graceful, like they were gliding just above the ground. I counted at least 6 of them, 3 on each side of the road. They stayed at the edge of my headlight range, never getting close enough for me to see them clearly, but never falling behind either. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down. It was like they were escorting me through their territory. The temperature in my cab started dropping, and I could see my breath even with the heater running full blast. Frost was forming on the inside of my windows, which should have been impossible in the Nevada desert in September. The fog outside was now so thick it looked like I was driving through cotton, and the shapes were getting bolder, moving closer to the truck. That's when my engine started acting up. The diesel began running rough, like it was getting bad fuel or losing power. My RPMs were fluctuating wildly, and the engine temperature was spiking into the red zone. I was afraid the engine might seize up and leave me stranded in this fog with those things moving around outside. I pulled over at what looked like a wide spot on the shoulder, though it was hard to tell with the limited visibility. As soon as I stopped, the shapes converged on my truck. They surrounded the cab, and I could hear them moving around outside, not footsteps, but a sound like fabric being dragged across metal. One of them approached the driver's side window. Through the fog and frost, I could make out a vague outline pressed against the glass. It was definitely humanoid in shape, but wrong in proportion. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in impossible ways. Where its face should have been, there was just a smooth, pale surface with 2 dark patches that might have been eyes. It stayed there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, studying me through the glass. I could feel its presence like a weight in my chest, making it hard to breathe. The temperature in the cab continued to drop until I was shivering uncontrollably, and ice was forming on every metal surface inside the truck. Then it started tapping on the window. Not random tapping, but a deliberate pattern. 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps again. It was SOS in Morse code. Whatever this thing was, it was trying to communicate with me. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to start the engine and get out of there, but I was surrounded, and I couldn't see well enough to drive safely. So I tapped back on the window. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. I acknowledged its signal. The tapping stopped, and the shape moved away from the window. I could hear them all moving around the truck now, making that strange dragging sound. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, and then suddenly everything went quiet. The fog began to thin, and I could see stars appearing overhead again. The shapes were gone, vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared. Within another few minutes, the fog had dissipated completely, and I was sitting on the shoulder of Highway 375 under a crystal-clear night sky. I tried to restart my engine, and it fired up immediately, running smooth as silk. The temperature gauge was back to normal, and all my electrical systems were working perfectly. It was like the mechanical problems had never happened. But when I got out to do a visual inspection of my truck, I found evidence that something had definitely been there. There were handprints on the windows, or what looked like handprints, though they were too large and had too many fingers. The prints were etched into the glass like they'd been made with acid, and no amount of cleaning could remove them completely. More disturbing were the marks on the trailer. Something had been examining my cargo, running what looked like tools or instruments along the sides of the trailer. The marks were precise, almost surgical, like someone had been taking measurements or samples. Some of the metal showed signs of extreme heat, while other areas looked like they'd been flash frozen. I completed my delivery to Ely without further incident, but the construction foreman who received the load noted that some of the concrete forms had been altered. They were still functional, but they'd been modified in ways that actually made them more efficient and stronger than the original design. When I asked him what he meant, he showed me microscopic changes to the surface that created better bonding with concrete and improved structural integrity. I filed a report with my company, but they classified it as unexplained weather phenomena and moved on. The insurance company covered the cost of replacing the etched windows, but they couldn't explain how glass could be damaged in that way without breaking. Since that night, I've talked to other drivers who've had similar experiences on Highway 375. There's a pattern to the encounters. The sudden fog that doesn't behave naturally. The temperature drop. The tall figures that move like they're not quite bound by gravity. Some drivers report that their cargo is examined or modified, always in ways that somehow improve the materials. I've driven Highway 375 3 more times since then, always during the day. Each time I've stopped at the spot where I encountered the fog and the shapes. There's nothing unusual about it in daylight, just another stretch of desert highway with sagebrush and sand. But if you look carefully, you can sometimes see strange patterns in the sand, geometric shapes that don't occur naturally. The locals in the nearby towns have stories going back decades about the fog people on Highway 375. They say the encounters happen maybe once or twice a year, always at night, always during certain weather conditions. Most people who experience it are too frightened or embarrassed to report it, but the stories persist. I've done some research on the area, and I learned that Highway 375 runs parallel to the boundaries of several classified military installations. Some people think the encounters are related to experimental aircraft or weather modification programs. Others believe the area has always been a crossing point for things from other dimensions or worlds. I don't know what those shapes were that surrounded my truck that night. They could have been extraterrestrial visitors, interdimensional beings, or some kind of advanced military technology. What I do know is that they were intelligent, they were curious about our technology, and they were capable of manipulating matter in ways we don't understand. The experience changed how I think about the world and my place in it. We share this planet with intelligences that are far beyond our current understanding, and most of the time, they choose to remain hidden from us, but sometimes on lonely stretches of desert highway. The barriers between our worlds become thin, and we get a glimpse of what else is out there. I still drive truck, and I still love the freedom of the open road. But I'm more aware now of the mysteries that surround us, especially in the remote corners of the Southwest. Highway 375 earned its nickname as the Extraterrestrial Highway, and after what I experienced in that fog, I understand why the government doesn't try very hard to discourage the UFO tourists and conspiracy theorists. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened. That fog wasn't natural, those shapes weren't human, and whatever examined my cargo that night left evidence of technology that's decades or centuries ahead of anything we have. I keep the etched handprints on my windows as a reminder of that night. Other truckers ask me about them sometimes, and I tell them they're from a hailstorm. It's easier than trying to explain the truth, and most people wouldn't believe me anyway. But I know what I saw in that fog on Highway 375, and I know I wasn't alone out there in the desert. The question that haunts me is whether that encounter was a random event or whether I was specifically chosen for some reason. And if I was chosen, what happens the next time they decide they need to examine something I'm hauling? I'm Linda Carter, and I've been a long-haul trucker for 19 years. Started driving right after my husband passed away. Needed a way to support myself and my daughter, and trucking offered good money for someone willing to work hard and spend time away from home. Over the years, I've become known as one of the more reliable drivers in my company, always on time, always safe, always in communication. Communication is everything in this business. Your CB radio isn't just entertainment, it's your lifeline. Other truckers warn you about speed traps, road conditions, accidents ahead. Dispatchers coordinate your loads and deliveries. Emergency services can reach you if something goes wrong. I've always been meticulous about maintaining my radio equipment and staying current with all the channels and protocols. That's why what happened to me on Highway 375 last October was so disturbing. I was hauling a load of medical supplies from Los Angeles to a hospital in Denver, critical medications that couldn't be delayed. My usual route would have taken me through Vegas and up I-15, but there was a massive storm system moving through Utah that would have cost me a day or more in delays. My dispatcher suggested Highway 375 as an alternate route. I'd heard the stories about that highway. Truckers call it spooky, say weird things happen there at night. But I'd also heard it could save time if you were willing to drive through some empty country. With critical medical supplies in my trailer, I decided to take the risk. I entered Highway 375 around 10 p.m., and at first, everything seemed normal. Clear night, good visibility, no traffic. I had my CB tuned to channel 19, the standard trucker frequency, and I was picking up occasional chatter from drivers on I-15 and other highways in the region. Nothing unusual. About 30 miles into the desert stretch, I started hearing something strange on the radio. It began as just background static, the kind you get when you're between radio towers. But this static had a pattern to it, almost like it was pulsing with a rhythm. I tried adjusting the squelch and changing channels, but the static followed me across the entire band. Then I started hearing voices in the static. At first, they were just fragments, words or phrases that could have been normal radio transmissions breaking through atmospheric interference. But as I listened more carefully, I realized these voices were speaking in reverse. Not just backwards words, but entire conversations played in reverse, like someone had recorded normal speech and then played the recording backwards. I'm not easily spooked, but hearing voices speaking backwards in the middle of the Nevada desert at midnight was unsettling. I tried different channels, but the reverse speech was on all of them. Sometimes it sounded like multiple conversations overlapping, creating this bizarre cacophony of backwards words and phrases. Then one of the voices mentioned my name. Retnak Adnil, Kurteretni. It took me a moment to realize what I was hearing. Linda Carter and Red Truck spoken backwards. I was driving a red Peterbilt and someone, or something, on the radio knew my name and was describing my truck. I pulled over and tried to respond on Channel 19. "This is Linda Carter in the red Peterbilt on Highway 375. Is someone trying to reach me?" The response came immediately, but it was still in reverse. "Pu deeps, eg derb 8 aero feb. Thgar 8 ek." I grabbed a notebook from my glove box and started writing down the phonetic sounds, then trying to read them backwards. "Speed up, before the bridge, take the right." As I worked out the message, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was a bridge about 10 miles ahead where Highway 375 crossed a dry wash. The voice was warning me about something at that bridge and telling me to take a right. But there was no right turn at that bridge, just open desert. I got back on the radio. "Unknown station, this is Linda Carter. Please repeat your message in normal speech. I can't understand you clearly." The response was immediate and clear, but still spoken backwards. "Nedika gib, seltrup ruof, egna skol, edisthgir etno tratsfognimok." I worked it out. "Big accident. 4 turtles, logs hang, coming off start on the right side." That made no sense to me. 4 turtles? Logs hang? But as I approached the bridge, I saw what the voice had been trying to warn me about. A logging truck had jackknifed on the far side of the bridge, and logs were scattered across both lanes. There were 4 vehicles involved in the accident, and if I hadn't been warned, I would have come over that rise at highway speed and plowed right into the wreckage. I was able to slow down in time and pull off to the right shoulder, just like the voice had instructed. I called 911 to report the accident, but when the dispatcher checked, they said emergency crews were already en route. Someone had called it in 20 minutes earlier, even though the accident had just happened. I waited for the road to clear, and during that time I kept monitoring my CB radio. The reverse speech continued, but now it seemed to be describing events that hadn't happened yet. The voices talked about a truck fire near mile marker 47, an elk crossing at dawn near the Utah border, and a disabled vehicle at the junction with US 6. I decided to test whether these were genuine predictions. I wrote down what I could decipher and kept track of the timestamps. Over the next 6 hours, every single prediction came true exactly as described. The truck fire happened at mile marker 47 at 2:15 a.m. A small herd of elk crossed the highway at dawn just inside the Utah border, and when I reached the junction with US 6, there was indeed a broken-down RV on the shoulder, but the voices weren't finished with me. As dawn approached, they began describing my own immediate future in disturbing detail. They knew I would stop for fuel at a specific truck stop, what I would order for breakfast, even what pump number I would use. They described conversations I would have with other truckers and phone calls I would make to my dispatcher. Everything they predicted happened exactly as they described it. I felt like I was living in a script written by someone else, following a predetermined path that had been mapped out for me in advance. The feeling was deeply unsettling, like I had lost control of my own life and was just going through the motions of someone else's plan. The final prediction was the most disturbing. As I was approaching Denver, the voices told me that I would receive a phone call from my daughter at exactly 11:47 a.m. with news that would change my life forever. They didn't say what the news would be, just that it would be life-changing, and that I should be prepared. At 11:47 a.m., my phone rang. It was my daughter Sarah calling to tell me that she was pregnant with her first child. It was wonderful news, and I was thrilled to learn I was going to be a grandmother. But the fact that the voices on Highway 375 had predicted this personal moment 12 hours in advance was terrifying. I delivered my load to the hospital in Denver and immediately drove to a truck stop to try to make sense of what had happened. I called my company's maintenance department and had them check my radio equipment. Everything was working perfectly and there was no evidence of any malfunction or modification. I also called my daughter to get more details about her pregnancy. She told me she'd only found out that morning when she took a home pregnancy test. She'd decided to call me immediately to share the news. There was no way anyone monitoring radio transmissions could have known about her pregnancy before she did. Over the next few weeks, I researched everything I could find about Highway 375 and unusual radio phenomena. I learned that other truckers had reported similar experiences, radio transmissions that seemed to predict future events, voices speaking in codes or foreign languages, and broadcasts that originated from channels that didn't officially exist. Some of the reports went back decades. In the 1970s and 1980s, truckers reported picking up radio signals that seemed to be from aircraft or ground control stations. But when the FAA investigated, they found no record of any transmissions matching those descriptions. In the 1990s, several drivers reported hearing what sounded like NASA mission control broadcasts during times when no space missions were active. The most common theory is that the area around Highway 375 experiences some kind of atmospheric anomaly that allows radio signals to travel through time or across dimensional barriers. The proximity to classified military installations has led some people to believe the phenomena are related to experimental communication technologies. But I think there's something more going on. The voices that spoke to me that night weren't just random signals bouncing around the atmosphere. They knew who I was, what I was driving, and where I was going. They provided specific warnings that saved my life and accurate predictions about my future. That suggests intelligence and purpose, not just random electromagnetic interference. I've driven Highway 375 several times since that night, but I've never heard the reverse speech again. My radio works normally, picking up standard trucker chatter and commercial broadcasts. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through remote areas, I'll hear fragments of strange transmissions, voices speaking in languages I don't recognize, numerical codes being read by computer-generated voices, or what sounds like technical discussions about subjects I don't understand. I've started carrying a digital recorder in my truck, hoping to capture some of these transmissions for analysis. But whenever I try to record them, my equipment malfunctions or the signals disappear. It's like whatever is generating these broadcasts doesn't want to be documented or studied. The experience on Highway 375 changed my perspective on a lot of things. I used to think of reality as something fixed and predictable, but now I understand that there are forces and intelligences operating beyond our normal perception. The fact that those voices could predict my daughter's pregnancy hours before she even knew about it suggests that time isn't as linear as we assume, or that some beings exist outside our normal temporal framework. I still drive truck and I still rely on my CB radio for communication and safety. But I'm more aware now of the mysterious signals that share the airwaves with our normal transmissions. Somewhere out there, intelligences are monitoring our communications, tracking our movements, and occasionally reaching across whatever barriers separate us to provide warnings or guidance. Sometimes I wonder if the voices that night were trying to help me, or if I was just caught up in some larger plan that I couldn't understand. Either way, I'm grateful for the warning about that accident. Without it, I might not have lived to become a grandmother. But I can't shake the feeling that my encounter with the reverse speech on Highway 375 wasn't a random event. Those voices knew too much about me, were too specific in their predictions for it to be coincidence. I think I was chosen for some reason, selected to receive those transmissions and those warnings. The question that haunts me is chosen by whom and for what purpose? My name is Marcus Reed, and I've been driving 18-wheelers for 16 years. I've hauled everything from livestock to hazardous chemicals, driven in every kind of weather you can imagine, and covered more miles than I care to calculate. I pride myself on being a professional driver who maintains complete control of my vehicle at all times. That's why what happened to me on Highway 375 shook me to my core. It was a Tuesday night in March, and I was hauling a load of computer equipment from San Jose to a tech company in Colorado Springs. The load was valuable, about $200,000 worth of servers and networking hardware, so I was being extra careful about security and timing. My route took me through Nevada, and to save time, my dispatcher had routed me down Highway 375. I'd heard the stories about Highway 375, but I'd also driven plenty of remote highways at night without incident. I figured most of the tales were just truckers trying to one-up each other with spooky stories. How wrong I was. I entered Highway 375 around 11 p.m., and for the first hour, everything was completely normal. Clear night, no traffic, good road conditions. My Freightliner was running perfectly. Engine temperature normal, all systems green, pulling the load like it was empty. I was making excellent time and feeling good about the run. That's when I first saw the light. It started as just a glimmer in my rearview mirrors, like another vehicle coming up behind me. But as I watched, the light got brighter and started changing position. Instead of staying behind me on the highway, it began rising into the air above and behind my truck. At first, I thought it might be a helicopter, maybe military or law enforcement doing some kind of night operation. We were near Area 51 after all, and I'd heard that military aircraft sometimes operated in the area. But helicopters make noise, and I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my diesel engine. The light continued to rise until it was maybe 100 feet above the highway, pacing my truck perfectly. It was roughly circular, about the size of a small airplane, and it glowed with this steady, pulsing white light that was bright enough to cast shadows inside my cab. I tried my CB radio to see if anyone else was seeing this thing, but all I got was static. I tried my cell phone to call my dispatcher, but there was no signal. That was unusual. I'd driven this route before during the day and had decent cell coverage for most of it. The light stayed above and behind me for about 20 minutes, and I was starting to get used to it. Then it started moving forward, sliding along above my truck until it was directly overhead. That's when things got really strange. My steering wheel began to feel different. It was still responding to my input, but there was this strange resistance, like something else was trying to influence the direction of the truck. At first it was subtle. Just a slight pull to the left or right that I could easily correct. But gradually the resistance got stronger. Then my truck started changing lanes on its own. I was driving in the right lane, and suddenly my steering wheel began turning to the left, smoothly and deliberately guiding the truck toward the center line. I fought it, trying to steer back to the right, but it was like wrestling with power steering that had a mind of its own. The truck moved into the left lane, then back to the right, then back to the left again. It wasn't erratic or dangerous. The movements were smooth and controlled, like someone who knew how to drive a big rig was making the adjustments. But that someone wasn't me. I tried downshifting to slow down, but my transmission wouldn't respond. I tried the brakes, and the pedal felt normal, but the truck didn't slow down. I was still moving at 65 miles per hour, but I was no longer controlling the vehicle. Something else was driving my truck, and I was just along for the ride. The light above me got brighter, and I started feeling strange physical sensations. My arms and legs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. My vision began to blur around the edges, and there was this high-pitched ringing in my ears that got louder and louder. I tried to stay focused, tried to regain control of my truck, but my body wasn't responding to my mental commands. It was like being conscious but paralyzed, aware of what was happening but unable to do anything about it. The truck began to slow down, even though I wasn't touching the brakes. It pulled off Highway 375 onto a dirt road that I hadn't noticed before. The road was smooth and straight, leading out into the desert toward what looked like a flat, open area about a mile from the highway. As we approached this clearing, I could see that it wasn't empty. There were other vehicles there, maybe a dozen cars and trucks parked in a perfect circle around the perimeter. Some of them looked like they'd been there for hours, maybe days. Others looked newer, like they'd just arrived. My truck stopped at the edge of this circle and the engine shut off by itself. The light above me descended until it was hovering maybe 50 feet off the ground, and I could see it more clearly now. It definitely wasn't any kind of aircraft I'd ever seen before. It was disc-shaped, maybe 60 feet across, with a smooth metallic surface that reflected the stars like a mirror. There were no visible engines, no wings, no propellers, nothing that would explain how it stayed aloft. The paralysis I'd been feeling got stronger, and I found myself unable to move at all. I could still see and hear and think clearly, but my body was completely unresponsive. It was like someone had disconnected my brain from my muscles, leaving me trapped inside my own body. That's when I saw them. Figures began emerging from the shadows around the parked vehicles. They were tall and thin, maybe 7 feet in height, moving with a fluid grace that didn't look quite human. In the dim light from the craft overhead, I couldn't make out their features clearly, but their proportions were wrong. Arms too long, heads too large, movements too smooth and coordinated. They approached each of the vehicles, including my truck. One of them came to my driver's side door and seemed to study me through the window. Even though I couldn't see its face clearly, I had the overwhelming sense that it was looking directly into my eyes, examining me like a scientist studying a specimen. The door of my truck opened, even though it was locked. The figure reached in and placed what felt like a cold, metallic hand on my forehead. Immediately, I felt a strange, tingling sensation, and my vision began to change. Instead of seeing the desert clearing and the parked vehicles, I started seeing images that seemed to be projected directly into my mind. I saw Earth from space, but it looked different. The continents were the same, but the lights from cities and towns were arranged in patterns I didn't recognize. I saw vast machines moving across the landscape, reshaping terrain and atmosphere. I saw humans working alongside beings that looked like the figures examining me. The images kept coming. Underground cities connected by tunnels that stretched for hundreds of miles, floating cities above the clouds, spacecraft traveling between planets like they were crossing state lines. It was like someone was showing me a documentary about Earth's future, or maybe an alternate version of Earth that existed parallel to our own. During this vision, I became aware that the beings were examining my truck as well. I could sense them moving around the vehicle, opening the trailer, studying my cargo. But they weren't stealing anything. They were analyzing, learning, understanding how our technology worked and how it might be improved. The mental images stopped, and I found myself back in the driver's seat of my truck. The figure removed its hand from my forehead, and gradually I began to regain control of my body. Feeling returned to my arms and legs, and I could move my head and blink my eyes. The beings retreated to the shadows around the parked vehicles, and the craft above began to rise. As it ascended, the other vehicles in the circle started their engines simultaneously. One by one, they began driving back toward Highway 375, forming a convoy of cars and trucks heading back to the main road. My truck started itself, and I felt control of the steering wheel return to my hands. But I wasn't driving alone. I could sense a presence guiding me, showing me the way back to the highway. It was like having an invisible co-pilot who knew the route better than I did. When I reached Highway 375, the other vehicles dispersed in different directions. Some went north, others south. A few headed east on side roads I hadn't noticed on my way in. Within minutes, I was alone on the highway again, driving south toward Las Vegas as if nothing had happened. But something had definitely happened. When I checked my watch, I discovered that 4 hours had passed. According to my logbook and the truck's computer, I should have been in Las Vegas by 2 a.m., but it was now 6 a.m., and I was still an hour out from the city. I stopped at the first truck stop I came to and did a complete inspection of my vehicle. Everything looked normal. No damage, no missing parts, no signs of tampering. But when I checked my cargo, I found that some of the computer equipment had been modified. The changes were subtle but significant. Circuit boards had been upgraded with components I didn't recognize, processors had been enhanced with microscopic additions, and some of the networking hardware had been configured in ways that weren't in the original specifications. When I delivered the load, the receiving technicians were amazed by the performance improvements. The company that received the shipment asked me what route I'd taken, thinking maybe the equipment had been upgraded somewhere along the way. When I mentioned Highway 375, they got very quiet and asked me not to discuss the delivery with anyone else. They paid me a substantial bonus for discretion and offered me a permanent contract to handle their high-value shipments. I've made that run a dozen times since then, always hoping to have another encounter. But Highway 375 seems normal now. No mysterious lights, no loss of control, no missing time, just desert highway connecting one place to another. But the experience changed how I think about my job and my place in the world. I used to think of myself as just a truck driver moving cargo from point A to point B. Now I understand that I might be part of something larger, a network of transportation that includes not just human commerce, but exchanges with intelligences that operate on a completely different level. The modifications to my cargo suggest that the beings I encountered are interested in our technology, but not to steal or destroy it. They seem to want to improve it, to accelerate our technological development in ways that benefit both species. The question is why, and what they get in return. I've talked to other drivers who've had similar experiences on Highway 375 and other remote highways throughout the Southwest. There's a whole community of truckers who've lost time, had their vehicles controlled by outside forces, and found their cargo mysteriously improved or modified. Most of us don't talk about it openly. Who would believe us? But we recognize each other by subtle signs and shared experiences. I still drive that route regularly, and I'm always alert for signs of another encounter. Part of me is terrified by the idea of losing control of my truck again, but part of me is curious about what I might learn the next time. The visions they showed me suggested a future where humans and these beings work together on projects that span solar systems. Maybe Highway 375 is more than just a road through the Nevada desert. Maybe it's a testing ground, a place where two species are learning to communicate and cooperate. And maybe some of us truckers are unwitting participants in the first steps of a relationship that will reshape both of our civilizations. The next time you see a big rig on the highway and wonder what the driver has experienced, remember that some of us carry more than just cargo. We carry questions about the nature of reality and our place in a universe that's far stranger and more connected than most people realize. I'm Sarah Nguyen, and I've been an owner-operator for 11 years. I run a small trucking business out of Sacramento specializing in oversized loads and special transport. My reputation is built on attention to detail and meticulous planning. I don't take shortcuts and I don't take risks with expensive cargo. That's why what happened to me on Highway 375 was so disturbing. It challenged everything I thought I knew about safety protocols and situational awareness. I was hauling a piece of industrial equipment from Los Angeles to a mining operation in Utah, a massive compressor worth about $500,000. The load required special permits and escort vehicles, but the mining company was in a hurry to get their equipment installed, so they were willing to pay premium rates for expedited delivery. My normal route would have been I-15 through Vegas, but there was a bridge closure that would have delayed me by at least a day. The mining company couldn't afford the downtime, so my dispatcher suggested Highway 375 as an alternate route. I'd heard stories about that highway, but I'd also made dozens of special transport runs through remote areas without incident. I always do thorough pre-trip and post-trip inspections, especially with valuable cargo. It's not just company policy. It's how you stay in business when you're hauling loads worth more than most people's houses. Every strap, every chain, every tie down gets checked and double-checked. I document everything with photos and written reports, and I've never had a load shift or come loose in 11 years of driving. I started the run at 6 a.m., making good time through the first part of the route. Highway 375 was actually pleasant to drive during the day. Good pavement, light traffic, beautiful desert scenery. I reached the halfway point around noon and stopped at a wide pullout to check my load and grab lunch. Everything was secure. The compressor was positioned exactly where it should be, and all my tie-downs were tight. I took photos from multiple angles, as is my standard practice, and noted the time and mileage in my logbook. The load would need to be secured for another 6 hours of driving, and I was confident everything would hold. I reached the delivery site in Utah late that afternoon and supervised the unloading of the compressor. The mining company's riggers were impressed by how well the load had been secured and how perfectly the equipment had arrived. I collected my payment and drove to a truck stop in Richfield to rest for the night. That's when I did my post-trip inspection and found something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dust around my truck and trailer. Not human footprints. These were larger, with an elongated heel and what looked like 4 toes instead of 5. The prints were clearly visible in the fine desert dust that had accumulated on the ground during my overnight stop. But here's what was really disturbing. The prints formed a perfect circle around my entire rig. Someone or something had walked around my truck and trailer multiple times, studying it from every angle. The prints were deep and clear, suggesting whatever made them was heavy, but they didn't show any scuffing or dragging that you'd expect from a human walking on soft ground. I grabbed my camera and documented everything, taking photos of individual prints and the overall pattern. The circle was precise, like it had been measured and marked out beforehand. The spacing between prints was consistent, suggesting a controlled, methodical pace rather than casual walking. I also noticed that the prints led away from my truck toward the open desert, but after about 50 yards, they simply stopped. Not faded away or became harder to see. They just ended abruptly, as if whatever made them had suddenly taken flight or vanished. I called the local sheriff's office to report what I'd found, but they seemed more amused than concerned. The deputy who took my call suggested that I'd probably seen tracks from local wildlife, maybe elk or deer that had wandered through the truck stop during the night. When I explained that these prints didn't match any animal I'd ever seen, he politely took my information but didn't seem inclined to investigate further. That evening, I started reviewing the photos I'd taken during my trip, trying to figure out when these prints might have appeared. That's when I discovered something even more unsettling. My security camera, which I always set up to monitor my truck during mandatory rest stops, had recorded the entire night. I watched the footage with growing horror as I saw myself get out of the cab around 2 a.m. and begin walking in circles around my truck. But it wasn't really me. The figure on the camera moved differently than I do, with longer strides and perfect posture. It walked the exact pattern that the footprints had traced, completing multiple circuits around the truck and trailer. After about an hour of this circular walking, the figure returned to the cab and disappeared inside. I have no memory of leaving my sleeper berth that night. I went to sleep around 10 p.m. and woke up at 6 a.m. feeling completely rested, but the camera clearly showed me, or something that looked like me, spending an hour walking around my truck in the middle of the night. The really disturbing part was that the footprints in the dust didn't match the figure on camera. The video showed normal human footsteps, but the prints in the dust were clearly non-human. It was like something else had been walking in my footsteps, leaving its own tracks in the places where I had walked. I immediately drove back to the truck stop and compared the footprints to my own boots. My boot prints were there too, overlaid with the strange elongated tracks. Whatever had made those prints had walked in exactly the same pattern I had walked, but left completely different marks in the dust. I spent the next several hours talking to other truckers at the truck stop, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual during the night. Most hadn't noticed anything, but an older driver named Bill told me he'd seen lights moving around my truck around 2 a.m. He'd assumed I was doing a security check on my load, which drivers sometimes do with valuable cargo. But here's the weird thing, Bill said. There were two sets of lights. One looked like a regular flashlight, but the other was this blue-white light that seemed to float around your truck without anyone carrying it. I asked Bill if he'd seen me during this security check, and he got a strange look on his face. "Well, I thought I saw you," he said. "But thinking back on it, something was off. You looked taller and you moved too smooth, like you were gliding instead of walking. I figured it was just the distance and the darkness playing tricks on my eyes." I thanked Bill and went back to examine my truck more carefully. In the daylight, I could see things I'd missed the night before. There were marks on the trailer that looked like handprints, but they were larger than human hands and had too many fingers. The marks were faint, almost like they'd been made by something that wasn't quite solid, but they were definitely there. More disturbing were the modifications I found to my cargo tie-downs. The chains and straps I used to secure the compressor had been adjusted, not loosened or damaged, but actually improved. The load was more securely fastened than when I'd initially tied it down, using techniques and anchor points that I hadn't thought of, but that were clearly superior to my original setup. I called my insurance company to report the incident, but how do you explain that someone broke into your truck to make your cargo more secure? They classified it as no loss and moved on. The mining company was thrilled with the condition of their compressor and offered me a bonus for the excellent handling. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that night. I researched everything I could find about Highway 375 and similar experiences. I learned that other truckers had reported finding strange footprints around their vehicles after overnight stops in remote areas throughout the Southwest. Some had also discovered modifications to their cargo that improved security or efficiency. A driver hauling electronics found that his load had been rewired to reduce electromagnetic interference. Another driver transporting medical supplies discovered that the temperature control system in his trailer had been upgraded with components that didn't appear in any manufacturer's catalog. The pattern suggested that whatever intelligence was responsible for these incidents was studying our transportation methods and making improvements. But why? And what did they get in return for their help? I decided to test this theory on my next run through Highway 375. I deliberately left some of my tie-downs slightly loose and positioned a hidden camera to monitor my truck during my rest stop. I wanted to see if the same thing would happen again. It did. The camera recorded me leaving my sleeper berth at 2:17 a.m. and walking around my truck for exactly 1 hour. But again, the figure on camera moved differently than I do, and when I checked in the morning, there were non-human footprints following the same path. This time I was prepared. I'd marked the positions of all my tie-downs with chalk before going to sleep. In the morning, I could see that several had been adjusted and improved, but the chalk marks showed exactly how they'd been moved. The modifications demonstrated a level of engineering knowledge that would take years of training to acquire. I also found something new. a small metallic object attached to the underside of my trailer. It was about the size of a silver dollar, perfectly smooth and warm to the touch. When I tried to remove it, it seemed to dissolve in my hands, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. I've made the Highway 375 run 6 more times since then, and the same thing happens every time I stop for the night in that area. I walk around my truck while I'm sleeping. Something else walks in my footsteps, leaving its own tracks, and my cargo gets mysteriously improved. I've started to think of it as a partnership of sorts. I provide access to our technology and transportation methods, and they provide improvements and upgrades that make my job easier and safer. It's not exactly a business relationship I would have chosen, but the results speak for themselves. My reputation in the industry has grown significantly over the past year. Customers request me specifically because cargo always arrives in perfect condition, often better secured than when it was loaded. My insurance rates have dropped because I've never had a claim, and I'm booked solid with high-value loads. But there's a personal cost. The experience of waking up to find evidence that I've been sleepwalking, or something worse, is deeply unsettling. I've had medical exams to rule out sleep disorders, and everything comes back normal. According to every test, I'm a healthy adult who sleeps soundly through the night. The security camera footage tells a different story. In the most recent recording, the figure that looks like me turns toward the camera at one point, and its eyes reflect the light like an animal's. The reflection is a pale blue color that doesn't match any human eye color I've ever seen. I've started carrying a GPS tracker in my pocket to see if I actually leave the truck during these episodes. The tracking data shows that I never move more than 50 feet from my cab, which matches the pattern of footprints around my truck. But it doesn't explain who or what is creating the non-human tracks that follow my path. The locals in the towns near Highway 375 have stories about walking dreams that go back generations. They say the desert spirits sometimes borrow human forms to study the modern world, leaving their own marks alongside the footprints of their temporary hosts. According to the folklore, this is considered an honor, a sign that the spirits trust you enough to share their knowledge. I'm not sure if what's happening to me is supernatural, extraterrestrial, or something else entirely. What I do know is that my life has improved significantly since these encounters began. My business is thriving. My loads are always secure, and I've learned techniques for cargo handling that I couldn't have figured out on my own. The price is living with the knowledge that every time I stop for the night on certain stretches of highway, I'm not sleeping alone. Something else is sharing my space, studying my methods and making improvements that benefit both of us. I still do my pre-trip and post-trip inspections with the same meticulous attention to detail. But now I also check for footprints in the dust, knowing that finding them means my cargo will arrive in even better condition than when I loaded it. It's not the kind of partnership I ever expected to have in this business, but it's turned me into one of the most sought-after drivers in the Southwest. And sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn when I'm driving through the desert, I feel like I'm not alone in the cab. There's a presence there, watching and learning, making sure that both of our interests are protected. The footprints in the dust have become a sign that I'm doing something right, that my work is valued by intelligences that operate on a level far beyond normal human understanding. It's strange, it's unsettling, but it's also somehow reassuring to know that in a universe full of unknowns, some of them are looking out for us. My name is Daniel O'Connor, and I've been driving cross-country routes for 22 years. I'm the kind of driver who lives by the clock. Precise delivery times, exact fuel stops, calculated rest periods. My logbooks are perfect, my GPS tracking is always accurate, and in over 2 decades of driving, I've never been late with a delivery. Time management isn't just part of my job, it's who I am as a professional. That's why what happened to me on Highway 375 last November was so devastating. It wasn't just a strange experience. It was a complete violation of everything I thought I understood about time, space, and reality. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Fresno to a farm cooperative in Kansas. The delivery window was tight but manageable. I had exactly 48 hours to cover 1,200 miles, which gave me a small buffer for fuel stops, mandatory rest periods, and potential delays. I'd run this route dozens of times before and knew every mile marker, every truck stop, every shortcut. My dispatcher suggested Highway 375 as a way to avoid traffic congestion around Las Vegas. It would add maybe 30 miles to the total distance but could save 2 hours in driving time. Since I was already running close to my delivery deadline, I decided to take the route. I entered Highway 375 at 2:15 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. I remember the time precisely because I always log my route changes, and I'd just finished calculating that I would reach the junction with US 6 at approximately 4:45 p.m. The math was simple: 98 miles at an average speed of 60 miles per hour, accounting for the highway's curves and elevation changes. The first part of the drive was routine. Clear weather, good visibility, light traffic. I passed the little town of Rachel around 3:30 p.m. right on schedule. My truck was running perfectly, fuel consumption was normal, and I was making steady progress toward my destination. That's when things started to get strange. I first noticed something was wrong when I checked my watch after what felt like another hour of driving. Instead of showing 4:30 p.m. as I expected, my watch showed 2:45 p.m. I assumed it had malfunctioned, so I checked my phone and the truck's dashboard clock. They all showed the same time, 2:45 p.m. According to my instruments, I had somehow lost an hour and a half. But that wasn't possible. I had clear memories of the past 90 minutes of driving. I'd seen mile markers, passed landmarks, listened to radio programs. I couldn't have imagined an hour and a half of detailed experiences. I pulled over at the next wide spot and tried to make sense of what was happening. According to my GPS, I was at mile marker 23 on Highway 375, but I distinctly remembered passing mile marker 23 over an hour earlier. The GPS showed my location accurately on the map, but somehow I was in a place I'd already been, at a time that had already passed. I called my dispatcher on the satellite phone to report a potential equipment malfunction. When Jerry answered, he sounded confused. "Daniel, you just called me 20 minutes ago to report that you were entering Highway 375. Is everything okay?" I explained that I'd been driving for over 2 hours and was well into the highway, but Jerry insisted that his logs showed I'd only been on 375 for 30 minutes. According to his tracking system, I was making normal progress and was exactly where I should be for 2:45 p.m. That's when I realized that time itself was acting strangely on Highway 375. Somehow, I was experiencing time at a different rate than the rest of the world. What felt like hours to me were only minutes according to everyone else's clocks. I decided to conduct a test. I set my watch to match the truck's dashboard clock and drove exactly 10 miles, timing the distance carefully. The 10-mile stretch took what felt like 30 minutes of normal driving, but when I checked my watch, only 5 minutes had passed. Time was moving at 1/6 its normal rate for me, but everything else seemed normal. My speedometer showed accurate readings, my engine RPMs were consistent with my throttle position, and the radio programs I was listening to played at normal speed. It was only the passage of time itself that was distorted. The experience was deeply disorienting. I felt like I was trapped in a bubble where time moved differently, watching the rest of the world speed by while I crawled along at a fraction of normal temporal velocity. My mind was processing information at normal speed, but the external world had accelerated beyond my ability to keep up. I tried various experiments to understand what was happening. I called my dispatcher every few minutes by my perception, but he reported that hours were passing between my calls. I took photographs with timestamps, and they showed the same temporal distortion. Images that felt like they were taken minutes apart showed timestamps hours apart. The strangest part was that I never felt tired or hungry during this extended period. Normally, after several hours of driving, I would need to stop for food or rest. But despite experiencing what felt like 6 or 7 hours on Highway 375, I felt as alert and energetic as when I'd started. As I continued driving, I started noticing other anomalies. The sun's position in the sky wasn't changing as fast as it should have been. Mile markers seemed to repeat. I passed mile marker 67 three separate times according to my notes, but my GPS showed continuous forward progress. The landscape itself seemed to be shifting in subtle ways. Rock formations would look familiar, then slightly different, then familiar again. It was like the desert was reconfiguring itself while I drove, maintaining the general appearance of Highway 375 but constantly rearranging the details. Around what felt like 8 p.m. by my internal clock but was actually 4 p.m. according to my instruments, I encountered something that challenged my understanding of reality even further. I saw another truck ahead of me on the highway, traveling in the same direction. As I got closer, I realized it was my own truck. I was looking at myself from behind, watching my red Kenworth hauling the same agricultural equipment I was carrying. I could see the back of my own head in the driver's seat of the other truck. I tried to pass this duplicate of myself, but as I pulled into the left lane, the other truck moved left as well. When I moved back to the right lane, it moved right. We were perfectly synchronized, like one truck was the mirror image of the other. This continued for what felt like an hour. I was following myself down Highway 375, unable to get closer or fall behind. Then suddenly the other truck simply vanished. One moment it was there, clearly visible in my headlights, and the next moment the highway ahead was empty. The temporal distortion continued for what felt like the entire night. I experienced sunset, complete darkness, and then sunrise, but according to my clocks, only a few hours had passed. I watched the stars wheel overhead at an accelerated pace, like someone had sped up the rotation of the Earth. Finally, around what felt like dawn but was actually 6 p.m. according to my instruments, I reached the junction with US 6. As soon as I turned off Highway 375, time snapped back to normal. The disorientation was immediate and severe. Suddenly, everything was moving at the correct speed again, and I felt like I was racing forward through time. I pulled over at the first truck stop and tried to make sense of what had happened. According to my logbook and GPS records, I had traversed Highway 375 in exactly the time it should have taken, about 3.5 hours. But according to my subjective experience, I had been on that highway for over 12 hours. The agricultural equipment I was hauling arrived in Kansas exactly on time. There were no delays, no missed delivery windows, no problems with the schedule. From the outside, everything appeared normal. But I knew that I had experienced something impossible on Highway 375. I had blood tests done when I got home, wondering if exposure to some kind of radiation or chemical might explain the temporal distortion. The results showed elevated levels of certain isotopes that my doctor said were consistent with exposure to exotic matter or high-energy fields. He recommended follow-up tests with a specialist, but by the time I could schedule them, my blood chemistry had returned to normal. I also had neurological tests to rule out seizures or other brain abnormalities that might cause time distortion. Everything came back normal. According to medical science, there was nothing wrong with me that could explain experiencing 12 hours in the space of 3.5 hours. I've talked to physicists about the possibility of temporal anomalies, and they've suggested several theoretical explanations. Near massive gravitational fields, time can slow down relative to the outside world. In areas of intense electromagnetic activity, the perception of time might be altered. Some quantum theories suggest that time might not be as constant as we assume, that it could vary based on local conditions. Highway 375 runs near several classified military installations where exotic physics research takes place. It's possible that experiments with high-energy fields or gravitational manipulation could create pockets of altered space-time. Or maybe the area has natural properties that we don't yet understand, geological formations or mineral deposits that interact with time itself. I've driven Highway 375 three more times since that experience, always during the day, always with multiple timing devices to monitor any anomalies. Each time the highway has behaved normally, time passes at the expected rate, mile markers appear in sequence, and the landscape remains consistent. But I've talked to other drivers who've had similar experiences on remote highways throughout the Southwest. Stories of missing time, repeated landmarks, and journeys that take much longer or shorter than they should. There's a whole network of drivers who've encountered temporal anomalies, and most of us have learned to avoid certain routes during specific conditions. The experience changed how I think about time and reality. We assume that time is constant, that an hour is always an hour regardless of where you are or what you're doing. But my experience on Highway 375 proved that assumption wrong. Time can stretch, compress, loop back on itself, or split into multiple streams. I still drive cross-country routes, and I still maintain precise schedules. But I'm more humble now about the nature of time and space. I carry multiple timing devices, backup GPS units, and detailed logs of every mile I drive, and I avoid Highway 375 after dark, when the barriers between different temporal streams might be thinnest. Sometimes, when I'm driving through other remote areas late at night, I'll feel a familiar disorientation, a sense that time is moving differently than it should. When that happens, I find the nearest town and stop for the night. I've learned that some roads exist partially outside our normal time stream, and the best strategy is to recognize them and avoid them when conditions are right for temporal anomalies. The 12 hours I spent in 3.5 hours on Highway 375 taught me that reality is far stranger and more flexible than we assume. Time isn't the river we think it is. It's more like a vast ocean with currents and eddies and strange areas where the normal rules don't apply. And somewhere on Highway 375, there's still a version of me driving through the night, following my own truck through a desert where time moves like thick honey and the stars race across the sky like sparks from a fire. I think about him sometimes, wondering if he'll ever find his way back to the normal flow of time, or if he's destined to drive that endless loop forever. I'm Emily Brooks, and I've been a solo long-haul trucker for 14 years. I've driven every major highway in the continental United States, often alone for weeks at a time. I'm not easily intimidated. You can't be as a woman in this business. And I've handled everything from aggressive drivers to mechanical breakdowns to severe weather without losing my nerve. But what happened to me on Highway 375 last summer tested every ounce of courage and determination I'd built up over the years. I was hauling a load of solar panels from a manufacturing plant in Nevada to an installation site in Colorado. The load was valuable but not particularly hazardous, and the route was straightforward. I'd planned to take I-15 through Las Vegas, but road construction had created massive delays, and my delivery window was already tight. My dispatcher suggested Highway 375 as an alternate route. I'd heard the stories about that highway, and every trucker has, but I'd also driven plenty of remote roads without incident. I figured the tales were mostly exaggerated, The kind of stories that get bigger each time they're told. I was wrong. I entered Highway 375 around 10 p.m. on a clear Tuesday night. The first strange thing I noticed was that I seemed to be the only vehicle on the road. In 14 years of trucking, I'd rarely encountered a highway with absolutely no traffic, but Highway 375 was completely empty. No cars, no other trucks, no law enforcement, just me, and the endless black ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the horizon. About an hour into the drive, I first noticed the light in my rearview mirror. At first, I assumed it was another vehicle coming up behind me, probably another trucker running the same route to avoid the Vegas construction delays. But as I watched, I realized this light was behaving strangely. It wasn't the twin beams of headlights or the scattered pattern of running lights you'd expect from a truck or car. It was a single, steady glow, roughly circular, about the apparent size of a basketball held at arm's length. The light was an odd color, not the yellow-white of normal headlights, but a pale blue-white that seemed to pulse gently like it was breathing. The light maintained a constant distance behind me, maybe a quarter-mile back. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down. It stayed perfectly centered on the highway, never drifting left or right, never getting closer or falling further behind. I tried my CB radio to see if I could make contact with whoever was following me. Unknown vehicle following northbound on Highway 375. This is Emily in the blue Peterbilt. Do you copy? Nothing but static. I tried my cell phone to call my dispatcher, thinking maybe he'd gotten reports of military exercises or unusual activity in the area. No signal. That was odd. I'd had decent cell coverage when I'd entered the highway, and my phone showed full strength just an hour earlier. The light stayed with me for another hour, and I was starting to get nervous. As a woman driving alone, I'm always aware of my surroundings and potential threats. This felt different from normal road hazards, but it definitely felt threatening. That's when the light started getting brighter. It wasn't moving closer. The distance remained constant, but the intensity was increasing. What had been a gentle glow became a brilliant beacon that lit up the desert landscape around me. I could see my trailer clearly in the light, casting sharp shadows on the highway ahead. As the light intensified, I started experiencing equipment problems. My radio began cycling through stations on its own, picking up fragments of broadcasts in languages I didn't recognize. The GPS display started flickering, showing incorrect positions and routes that didn't exist. My engine temperature gauge spiked into the red zone, then dropped back to normal, then spiked again. The light continued to brighten until it was like having a small sun following behind me. The interior of my cab was flooded with that strange blue-white glow, and every metal surface was becoming warm to the touch. I had to squint to see the road ahead because of the glare in my mirrors. Then the light started to move. Instead of staying behind me, it began to rise and move forward, sliding along above the highway until it was positioned directly above my truck. The intensity was almost unbearable now, like being under stadium lights, but 100 times brighter. My truck started pulling to the left toward the shoulder. I fought the steering wheel, trying to keep the vehicle on the road, but it was like something was drawing me off the highway. The pull wasn't violent or jerky. It was steady and inexorable, like being caught in a slow but powerful current. I downshifted and tried to accelerate out of whatever was affecting my truck, but the pull only got stronger. My steering wheel was vibrating in my hands, and I could hear a low humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not just from outside the truck, but from inside the cab, from the seats, from my own body. The light above me descended until it was maybe 50 feet off the ground, and I could see it clearly for the first time. It wasn't a searchlight or flare or any kind of conventional illumination. It was a perfect sphere of light, maybe 30 feet in diameter, with no visible source or structure. It glowed from within like it was made of pure energy. As I stared up at it, I felt something happening to my mind. It wasn't painful, but it was intrusive, like someone was leafing through my thoughts and memories without permission. I could sense a presence examining my life, my childhood in Oregon, my decision to become a trucker, my experiences on the road, my relationships, my fears and hopes. The mental intrusion was accompanied by a flood of images that weren't my own. I saw vast cities that seemed to be made of light, spacecraft traveling between stars, beings that looked vaguely humanoid but were clearly not human. I saw Earth from space, but it looked different. The continents were the same, but there were structures in orbit and on the surface that don't exist in our world. During this mental contact, I became aware that the being or intelligence behind the light was trying to communicate with me. Not in words, but in concepts and emotions that bypassed language entirely. I understood that I had been chosen for some reason, selected from among the millions of people traveling American highways that night. The message was complex, but the core idea was that I was being offered a choice. I could continue my normal life, driving truck routes across the country with no memory of this encounter. Or I could accept a different role, becoming a kind of liaison or ambassador between their civilization and ours. I asked, not in words, but in the same conceptual language they were using, what this role would involve. The answer came as another flood of images and sensations. I would continue driving, but my routes would take me to specific locations at specific times. I would carry special cargo that wouldn't appear on any manifest. I would make contact with other chosen individuals and coordinate activities that were part of a larger plan. The choice had to be made immediately. I could sense the being's impatience, not hostility, but urgency. Whatever window of opportunity existed for this offer was closing rapidly. I made my decision. I chose to continue my normal life. The responsibility they were offering was too great, too far beyond my understanding. I was a truck driver, not a diplomat or ambassador. I belonged on Earth's highways, not as a bridge between civilizations. The being accepted my decision without anger or disappointment. I sensed something like respect, even approval. They had offered the choice honestly, and they respected my right to refuse. The light began to rise, moving up and away from my truck. As it ascended, control of my steering returned, and the equipment malfunctions stopped. My radio resumed normal operation. My GPS displayed accurate information, and my engine temperature returned to normal. But the being wasn't finished with me. As the light reached what looked like several hundred feet above the highway, it stopped and hovered. I could sense that they were leaving me with something, not a physical object, but a kind of awareness or sensitivity. From now on, I would be able to recognize others who had been contacted. I would know, without being told, when someone had encountered the intelligence behind the light, and if I ever changed my mind about the role they'd offered, I would know how to make contact with them again. The light shot straight up into the sky and disappeared among the stars. I was alone on Highway 375 again, driving through the Nevada desert with nothing but my headlights to guide me. I completed the delivery in Colorado without further incident, but the solar panel installation crew noted something unusual about the cargo. Some of the panels had been modified with microscopic improvements that increased their efficiency by nearly 15%. The changes were so sophisticated that the manufacturer wanted to study them, but I had no explanation for how they'd occurred. Since that night, I've encountered 7 other people who've been contacted by the same intelligence. 3 were other truckers who'd driven Highway 375 or similar remote routes. 2 were airline pilots who'd experienced unexplained encounters during flights over the Southwest. 1 was a train engineer who'd seen the light while crossing the Nevada desert on the California Zephyr route. The last was a rancher whose property bordered Highway 375. None of them had accepted the role that had been offered to me. We all made the same choice, to remain in our normal lives rather than become intermediaries between civilizations. But we all carried the same awareness, the same ability to recognize others who'd been contacted. I've driven Highway 3756 more times since that night, always hoping to see the light again. Not because I've changed my mind about their offer, but because the encounter was the most significant experience of my life. For a brief time, I was in contact with an intelligence that spans star systems, and I turned down the opportunity to be part of something cosmic in scope. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. My life as a trucker is good. I'm financially secure, I enjoy the freedom of the road, and I take pride in my work. But I can't help thinking about those images they showed me, those cities of light and spacecraft traveling between worlds. What would my life have been like if I'd said yes? The awareness they left me with has changed how I see the world. I'm more alert to unusual phenomena, more sensitive to the possibility that we share our world with intelligences we don't recognize. I've learned to trust my instincts about people and situations, and I've avoided several dangerous encounters because of the enhanced perception they gave me. I still drive solo routes across the country, and I still love the independence and challenge of long-haul trucking. But now I know that the highways I travel are monitored by beings with capabilities far beyond our current understanding. They're watching us, studying us, occasionally making contact with individuals they think might be suitable for some greater purpose. The light that followed me across Highway 375 was an invitation to step outside the normal boundaries of human experience. I declined that invitation, but I'm grateful for the glimpse it gave me of a universe far stranger and more connected than most people realize. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through remote areas, I'll catch a glimpse of unusual lights in my peripheral vision. When I look directly, they're usually just aircraft or radio towers. But occasionally, just occasionally, I'll see that distinctive blue-white glow, and I'll know that somewhere out there the offer is still open. My name is Robert Chen, and what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. I've been a long-haul trucker for 18 years, and I've always prided myself on being rational, practical, and skeptical of tall tales. But what happened to me at mile marker 14 on Highway 375 changed everything I thought I knew about the world we live in. It was a cold February night, and I was hauling computer components from Silicon Valley to a tech company in Denver. I'd made this run dozens of times before, usually taking I-15 through Las Vegas. But a multi-vehicle accident had shut down the interstate for hours, and my dispatcher was getting pressure from the customer about delivery times. "Take Highway 375, Jerry told me over the satellite phone. "Yeah, I know what the drivers say about it, but it'll save you 4 hours if you don't get stuck behind the cleanup crews. Every trucker on the Southwest routes knows about Highway 375. They call it the Extraterrestrial Highway, and not just because of the official state designation. For decades, drivers have reported strange experiences on that stretch of desert road, lights in the sky, equipment malfunctions, missing time, encounters with things that defy explanation. Most of us had heard the warnings about mile marker 14 in particular. Old-timers would tell rookies, "Whatever happens, don't stop at mile marker 14. If your truck breaks down there, call for a tow and wait inside your cab. Don't get out, don't investigate, and don't make eye contact with anything you might see." I'd always dismissed these stories as trucker folklore, the kind of legends that grow around any profession that involves long hours alone in remote places. But as I drove onto Highway 375 that February night, I found myself paying more attention to the mile markers than I ever had before. The first 13 miles were unremarkable. Clear, cold night with brilliant stars overhead. No other traffic, which wasn't unusual for a Tuesday night in the middle of nowhere. My truck was running perfectly. A 2019 Kenworth T680 with less than 200,000 miles on it, maintained meticulously by my company's service department. I was cruising at a steady 65 miles per hour when I saw mile marker 14 ahead in my headlights. As I approached, my truck started acting strangely. The engine began running rough, like it was getting bad fuel or losing compression. The temperature gauge spiked into the red zone, and warning lights started flashing across my dashboard. I managed to pull over just past the mile marker before the engine died completely. I sat in the cab for a few minutes waiting to see if it was just a temporary glitch. But the truck wouldn't restart. The engine would turn over but wouldn't catch, like it wasn't getting fuel or spark. I grabbed my cell phone to call for roadside assistance, but there was no signal. That was odd. I'd had decent coverage just a few miles back. I tried my satellite phone, but it was dead too, even though it had been working fine when I'd talked to my dispatcher an hour earlier. Against every instinct and every piece of advice I'd ever heard about mile marker 14, I got out of the truck to check under the hood. I told myself I was just being practical. Maybe there was a loose connection or a blown fuse I could fix myself. The desert night was absolutely silent. No wind, no insects, no distant highway noise, just complete oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even the sound of my own footsteps. The air smelled strange too, not the normal desert scent of sage and dust, but something metallic and sharp that made my nose burn. I popped the hood and started checking the obvious things: battery connections, fuse box, air filter. Everything looked normal. The engine was still warm, but not overheated like the temperature gauge had indicated. All the fluid levels were fine, and there was nothing out of place that I could see. That's when I noticed the lights. At first, I thought they were reflections from my own cab, but as I looked up and down the dark highway, I saw them hovering over the desert to my right. Brilliant pulsating orbs of white and blue light, moving in ways no aircraft could. They darted at impossible speeds, hovered in place, and then suddenly disappeared, only to reappear closer to me. My heart started pounding. Rational thoughts fled. I tried to step back into the cab, but a force, I couldn't describe it, seemed to press down on me, pinning me in place. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. The silence was deafening except for a low, humming vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw something moving in the sand near the edge of the road. Not an animal. Not human. It was tall, thin, and moved in a jerky, unnatural manner. Its skin, or whatever covered it, was pale, almost luminescent, reflecting the lights from the orbs. Its head turned toward me, and I felt, against all reason, like it was looking straight into my mind. Panic set in. I slammed the hood closed and bolted for the cab, fumbling to get the engine started. The keys shook in my hands. Just as I turned the ignition, the lights vanished, the figure disappeared, and everything went back to normal. The truck roared to life as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I drove the next 50 miles without a single hiccup, the desert returning to its usual empty, silent self. When I finally got cell signal and called my dispatcher, I sounded like a fool, stammering and panicked, unsure if I would even be believed. I never stopped at mile marker 14 again. I don't tell many people about what I saw that night. My coworkers think I'm exaggerating. My friends think I'm joking. But I know what I experienced. Rationality, skepticism, all of it, gone in a single night. There is something out there on Highway 375, something we can't explain. And mile marker 14 is a place where you don't stop. Every time I drive through that desert now, I check the mile markers. Every time I see 14, I press my foot a little harder on the accelerator just to get past it. Because once you've seen what I've seen, You never forget.